NATO allies have agreed that Ukraine will become a member of our alliance, but at the same time, that is a long-term perspective. What is the issue now is to ensure that Ukraine prevail as a sovereign independent nation, and that therefore we need to support Ukraine.
I see that the future of Ukraine is to be part of European Union and also member of NATO. We have taken many steps forward when it comes to military aid to Ukraine, and I'm very glad that we are now cooperating together much more closely to give Ukraine more heavy weapons. I think the discussion now, even though it's has taken some time, it's been very important concerning, for example, the Leopards. So countries are cooperating together more closely and more widely, and this is a very good thing. We have to support Ukraine as long as it takes, and they also need more heavy weapons. And the faster and the sooner we can give them more heavy weapons, the sooner the war will end. And this is something that we also need, that cooperation between the democratic countries. Finland has taken many decisions on arms support to Ukraine, and we are willing to continue this as long as it takes.
Yeah, easy for her to say, give them more heavy weapons, as she's looking sideways at the United States, right? It's easy for her to commit those. With us now is former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
These guys just don't know when to quit. We are on the brink of World War III. We know that NATO's expansion has been largely to blame for the current climate that we're in. And yet here they are. Here's the Secretary General of NATO saying Ukraine will be a part of NATO. I mean, what in the world is going on? Are they really trying to march us into World War III?
Well, I mean, the problem with the Secretary General is he can't backtrack from the years of history dating back to 2008 when the initial invitation was sent out to Ukraine. Indeed, one of the reasons why we're at war now is that NATO refused to acknowledge that it could, in fact, say no to Ukraine. Instead, NATO manufactured this open door policy, which doesn't exist. There's no article in the NATO charter that calls for an open door. It says that anybody who wants to join NATO must be considered by the complete alliance, which must evaluate the application based upon their national and collective security arrangements. To invite Ukraine into NATO at this juncture is to invite NATO into a world war with Russia. This is absurd in the extreme. But the good news is NATO will never be a member of NATO. I hate to break that news to Jan Stoltenberg and the Finnish prime minister, but NATO is on the verge of losing its gambit to use Ukraine as a proxy to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia. Instead, Russia has flipped the script, and they're on the verge of defeating the Ukrainian military. Jan Stoltenberg himself said earlier that Ukraine is going to run out of ammunition. Now, Jan may not be a military expert. I am. When you run out of ammunition against an enemy that's bigger than you and has ammunition, you're going to lose that fight. And Ukraine is going to lose this fight. And that'll solve the problem of whether or not Ukraine will ever be a member of NATO. They will never be a member of NATO.
Well, and he kind of gave that caveat a little bit when he made that statement, right? He says, Ukraine will be in the long run eventually, but first they have to actually win their independence or remain a sovereign independent nation. And maintain that in order for them to be a part of NATO. And that almost looked like, to me, that sounded like daring Russia, really, saying, okay, well, we're going to make them a part of NATO unless you win and take over the entire nation and it's no longer an independent nation. And that almost is, it then made me wonder if they want that, if that is the ultimate goal, if they wouldn't mind if Ukraine ultimately became another part of Russia, because then they could use that forever, right? Then Russia's forever this. Then they could point out and say, well, this is what Russia did. Look what they did. They took Ukraine. We knew they were going to do that. And now they can build this, I guess, forever Cold War, or even use it as a reason to maybe go into World War III. I mean, what do you think that there's maybe they maybe want Russia to end up taking over Ukraine?
Well, I don't know if that is an objective. I think what they recognize is the inevitability of Russian victory, and that NATO has pretty much backed itself into a rhetorical corner. They've made so many statements about achieving the strategic defeat of Russia, about supporting the Ukrainian military until the end, and things of that nature. That again, it was Jan Stoltenberg who acknowledged that Ukraine is going to lose this war. He didn't say that. He said they're going to run out of ammunition and there's nothing NATO can do to replenish it. That means Ukraine loses the war. So I think NATO is desperately looking for some sort of face-saving mechanism to disentangle themselves from this. And I think ultimately NATO is trying to find a way to come to grips with the inevitability of a Russian victory. What will that victory look like? How will they mitigate the consequences of this victory? But they have to do this in a face-saving way. So Stoltenberg can't say, and Ukraine will never be a member of NATO because that's giving in to one of Russia's demands. But what he has said is it's going to take a long time. And meanwhile, we have to defend, as you noted, not only Ukrainian sovereignty, but Ukrainian democracy, which, of course, is a joke because Ukraine is not a democratic state. But you're right. I think it leaves the door open to an outcome other than it's the outcome that's not said, the outcome that's in the room, but nobody wants to talk about, which is decisive Russian military victory over Ukraine and by extension over NATO.
How much of Ukraine are you talking about when you say that Russia is going to have this decisive win? I know that they're in the last stages in Bakhmut, that is looking like that is going to fall into Russian hands pretty quickly here. I mean, where do you see this going further? Are we talking all of Ukraine? Are we talking just the eastern side of Ukraine? What do you think that looks like?
I fall back on my old friend and mentor Ray McGovern, who is a old CIA hand, and he was a Soviet analysis back in the day. And he always said that the best way to figure out what your Soviet/Russian leadership is going to do is to listen to them, and they'll tell you. And Putin just gave a speech on February 21st to the Federal Assembly, and he told us what's going to happen. He said that Russia is going to secure the economic and social future of Novorossiya, that is Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk. The totality of these territories will be Russia because they are Russia. So that tells you right off the bat that this war doesn't end until Russia reclaims all of what it deems to be Russian territory. And then he said that the Russians won't stop until they push the Ukrainians back past the range of the longest range system provided by NATO. This is the HIMARS equipped with the small bomb missile, 150 kilometers. So we now know the limit of the Russian advance. It will be 150 kilometers away from the borders of Novorossiya and the Donbass. And this means the city of Kharkov, Odessa are now fair game. And I have to tell you that if Russia takes Odessa, or should I say when Russia takes Odessa, they're not going to stop until they achieve the land bridge with Transnistria, which is that breakaway area of Moldova that is sitting like a thorn in the side of NATO, Moldova, and Ukraine. So I think Vladimir Putin has made it clear what Russia is going to do. And in the process, they are going to, A, destroy the Ukrainian army. That's happening as we speak. And B, they're going to create the conditions for denazification, which means that the Zelensky regime will not survive this conflict. So Vladimir Putin has told us exactly what victory looks like.
Do you think, though, I mean, this has taken them, it's been a year, and I think many analysis was that that this would be very quick, that they would be, that this goal would be, many of us believe this. I thought this too. I thought that they would just go in and within a month they would have reached their objective. But it's been a year. It hasn't been as easy as they thought. Is there a possibility that Ukraine pushes back? I mean, we've seen some offenses that Ukraine has been able to actually enact and successfully so. And if there is a possibility that they do receive these heavy weapons that Santa Marin's talking about, maybe they do end up getting F-16s or whatever else it might be, is there a possibility that Ukraine is able to push back? I mean, we're seeing some chatter, from the Ukrainian side that they're going to go after Crimea. There's always this sort of posturing, but what are the chances that actually happens, do you think?
I think the chances of Ukraine taking Crimea are about on par with the chances of a snowball surviving in hell or me climbing Mount Everest, zero. Um, the fact is, even though this war's gone on for a year, it's not been a homogeneous conflict. It's been in phases. I too was one of the analysts that said that if Russia engaged militarily with Ukraine and in war, that this war would be over quick. And I'm 100% convinced that I would have been right. But Russia fooled everybody by not going to war. They carried out a special military operation, and we now know what was their goal. Their goal was to drive Ukraine to the negotiating table for a rapid conclusion to this conflict. And they almost succeeded. If you recall, there were three negotiations in Gomel in Belarus in early March, and it led to what should have been a, uh, a final negotiation where a peace treaty was signed in Istanbul on April 1st. But it was NATO that pulled the plug on that, leading to the second phase, which was Russia's attempt to use military forces to reconquer or to liberate, according to their terminology, the Donbass, Donetsk, and Lugansk. But they did so using the original complement of forces. Russia never mobilized for this. And this opened the door for Ukraine to reconstitute a defeated army because their military had been largely defeated by the Russians by June of last year. They received tens of billions of dollars worth of equipment, and they were able to launch a successful counterattack against an overextended Russian military that had insufficient forces to carry out the tasks assigned. And they were able to get some good results, the recapturing of Kharkov, the right bank of Kherson. But that's it. They burned out their reinforcements. They have nothing left. Russia, meanwhile, mobilized 300,000 reservists. They brought in an additional 180,000 volunteers. They've assembled a force that is close to 700,000 now, well equipped, well trained, well rested, against a Ukrainian military that's been depleted from 700,000 down to a little over 200,000. The number of dead is mind boggling. General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, said that NATO could not imagine the scope and scale of the violence taking place. And when he means by couldn't imagine, they're not ready for it. They're not trained for it. They're not equipped for it. What's going on in Ukraine today is mind boggling in terms of the death and destruction being dealt to the Ukrainian forces and indeed being absorbed by the Russian forces. But only now is Russia prepared to carry out the kind of offensive that we all thought was going to take place when this war started. And when they do, when these forces engage fully, it will be game, set, match Russia. It's over. Anybody who doesn't recognize that, and of course, these are words. It's like, people say, there's always a tweet. Well, there's always a video clip, and maybe I'm giving you that video clip, but I'm saying right now, anybody that doesn't recognize the inevitability of a decisive Russian victory probably isn't too well versed in military art.
Why do you think Finland and Sweden are so hot for joining NATO? It just seems to me that in fact, I want to play this clip because this kind of is why this becomes mind-boggling. So here's Zelensky. This was just the other day. He was speaking, and he's talking about, why Ukraine needs to win this war. And I don't blame the guy for using a lot of fear-mongering scare tactics to try to get people to pony up more weapons, countries to pony up more weapons and to support the war, to support their efforts against Russia. But he's saying, if we lose, essentially, then Russia's going to keep going, right? This has kind of been the narrative we've heard. They're going to keep expanding. They have the desire to go and reclaim the USSR and take all these other countries. And so they're going to expand into NATO nations. And when they expand into NATO nations, NATO has to go on NATO would need to defend. That means Americans. This is what Zelensky had to say.
The U.S. will have to send their sons and daughters exactly the same way as we are sending their sons and daughters to war. And they will have to fight because it's NATO that we're talking about. And they will be dying, God forbid, because it's a horrible thing.
So he's saying, they're going to be sending their own people and they're going to be the ones dying if they're having to defend NATO. So that's why you don't want Ukraine to lose. You don't want this to spread, is ultimately what his sort of message was. But this is really fascinating to me because you've got now these countries signing up, right, for NATO. For what purpose? It seems to me that if we do end up going into this World War III, which we're hoping we don't have to, but if we do, then they're really just signing up to be obligated to send their citizens to war. And NATO's almost pressuring them like, we need bodies. We're going to need people, a lot of people, because it might be Russia and it might be China. So we need a lot of people. And so we'll just go ahead and recruit the Finns and the Swedes. I mean, what is the logic, do you think, from their perspective?
Well, I think Finland and Sweden might be getting buyer's remorse about joining NATO at this juncture, because when they agreed to this was back in the Madrid summit in June of last year, when there was sort of a euphoria amongst NATO. The Russians hadn't performed well. NATO now had a reason to exist, and they had Russia on their heels. And so, they jumped on board as most. They opted out of neutrality that had done them so well. I mean, it's amazing. The Swedes have a tiny, tiny, tiny military because they don't need a big military. Finland likewise has a military that's of medium size, but nothing to write home about. Now they have to join NATO, and they're going to be frontline states, especially Finland. And one of the consequences of the Finnish and Swedish actions is that Russia has expanded its military from 900,000 to 1.5 million. That's a 600,000 increase that includes over 100,000 troops are now going to be permanently stationed along the Finnish border. So Finland used to have no problem with Russia. Now they got a big problem because I'll tell you what, Finns, this ain't 1939. The Russian military, if it ever did go to war against Finland, would wipe it off the face of the map. But the good news for NATO is that Russia has no intention of fighting NATO. Russia never has an intention of fighting NATO. It's not part of Russia's strategic vision. So this is just Zelensky nonsense. And with all due respect, Mr. President of Ukraine, stop talking about American sons and daughters. Okay, I served in my country. I know what it means to go to war for my country. We're not going to go to war for you. That's an absolute guarantee. American boys and girls will not die for Ukraine. We might give you the equipment that allows you to sacrifice more of your troops, but we're not going to die for you. Your country isn't worth one drop of American blood.
I guess that would be the big question, is whether or not Americans would tolerate that. If they would tolerate, at what level would they tolerate maybe special forces, maybe some covert operations that involve some Americans that maybe end up not making it. What do you think the threshold is?
That's already happened. We know that there's CIA paramilitaries on the ground in Ukraine, and we know that the Joint Special Operations Command rotates commandos in and out of Ukraine, primarily for logistics and advisory capacity. They're not frontline troops, and there's the potential of them, getting caught up in a conflict and dying. But the notion that the United States is going to put an organized force of conventional, military power on Ukrainian soil to fight Russians is just absolutely absurd in the extreme. First of all, no U.S. military commander would permit it. As General Cavoli said, we don't have the capacity to fight this war. We need artillery. We don't have it. Our airplanes cannot operate in the kind of dense integrated air defense environment that exists over Ukraine and Russia. Our Air Force simply would be shot out of the sky. Our forces would run out of ammunition and die the way the Ukrainian forces are dying. And given the scope and scale of the violence, this isn't going to be about 10, 20, 30 Americans coming home in body bags. This will be thousands. In fact, the totality of the force that we commit. So no American general would say it's a good idea to put American troops on the ground in Ukraine for any reason.
Yeah. Scott, thank you so much for your analysis. Thanks for being here. Former UN weapons inspector and former Marine Corps intelligence officer, Scott Ritter. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Birch Gold, I must tell you all about. It's a good time to be investing in gold. You may find that the value of the dollar seems a bit unstable these days. You might find that your retirement savings may dwindle, and you're a little worried about that. So if you are worried about the instability from the economy or the instability of us potentially marching to World War III, then investing in gold is a great idea for you potentially to look into. Go to birchgold.com/Kim, get your free info kit. The specialist will contact you. They will walk you through the process of converting your existing IRA or your existing 401k into an IRA in precious metals. They will talk to you about which precious metals you may or may not want to invest in. If you want to do it the old-fashioned way, buy yourself some gold bars and store them, or if you want to get yourself an IRA in precious metals, they will walk you through that. All you got to do is go to birchgold.com/Kim to get that free info kit.